And a lot of people in this country do not like young people. We have a society that often frames teenagers as a risk rather than at risk. A chicken shop owner saying, oh, no, every time things start to heat up in here, I just give out free chicken wings and it calms everyone down. And he's doing guardianship. Like, he wouldn't call it that, but he's doing guardianship. He's kind of keeping the peace. Remember what it was like to be a teenager in the first place. What a time to be alive.
Before we get into it, I just want to let you know that there'll be some sensitive themes covered in this conversation, from violence affecting children and young people to child exploitation. So please listen and watch with care. Hey, Carlene.
Hi.
How's it going?
Good, thank you.
Good to have you here. We'll get straight into it. There's lots to talk about, but I just wanted to start with a really simple question. This podcast is called The Safe Podcast, so we're interested in keeping young people safe. What did being safe mean to you when you were young?
It's a good question. I think being safe to me felt being able to be myself, and there was definitely an element of things being predictable or not predictable. So where I felt unsafe was in situations where things were unpredictable. If I didn't know what was going to happen to me or to someone I cared about, I felt very unsafe. So I was a stickler for routine. So anywhere that I could get routine in my life, I felt very safe. I felt very safe at school. I felt very safe doing certain activities where there was some predictability to it. Elements of my life that were less predictable felt a lot less safe.
What of that inspired you to then go into some of the work that you've ended up doing?
A lot of the work I've ended up doing has happened accidentally, but I think what enabled me to see the things that I now work on was how important the contexts around me were to growing up. I mean, I lost my dad when I was 14. Me and my 3 younger brothers and mum faced a number of challenges and hurdles growing up. And so there may be the temptation for others to look and say, well, you experienced challenges as a child, as a teenager, and you've done okay, so everyone should do okay no matter the challenges they face. And I just don't see life like that, because yes, I experienced those challenges, but I also had very significant relationships and contexts in which those relationships was protected that meant I was okay. It wasn't as simple as I just needed grit or determination. I needed people who loved me and believed in me and could be patient with me, and they needed environments in which they could demonstrate that love and patience and belief. Whether that was my history teacher, Mr. Whelpdale, who kind of held me firm during my period of bereavement. He was incredible. And when he left our school, when I was going into my final years of A-level, I wrote him a thank you letter, and he wrote me a card on when I got my A-level results. And over the years, I've visited him at different schools and spoken to his students as he's kind of gone on and led other schools. Or whether that was my mum being very much held in a church community, so that she was able to have the capacity to care for us. And surround us with a network of people that cared for us as well. So when my dad died, I was at the home of somebody who we knew through church because my mum was at the hospital. So all of those contexts were so important to my welfare and to my sense of safety. Having a relationship is not enough if you haven't got an environment in which you can be in that relationship. So I think once young people then started to talk to me, and most of my early work was just speaking to young people, I could hear context in their voices. And even then, I didn't pay enough attention to it, I don't think, until I had the time to do a PhD. But all of that made absolute sense to me, because that was exactly what I knew had kind of carried me through my childhood as well.
And you referred to it just then. You obviously started working with young people, and that was the start of your career rather than the academic part of it, which obviously came a bit later, which we'll get onto in a sec. But how did it start, like professionally, the topics that you're working on now? How did, what was the entry point for that?
So I had quite a convoluted entry point because I wanted to be a journalist. And when I was at university, I did philosophy, and I interned at loads of magazines and newspapers while I was studying And when I left, I had done an internship at The Guardian and a junior writing course there, under the mentorship of Joseph Harker, who's still there, and he was incredible. But quite quickly, I realised that maybe journalism wasn't for me, and I was actually only interested in writing on very particular topics, really social justice issues. And I got some great advice while I was there, which is either kind of knuckle down and work as a journalist for the next 10, 20 years until you get to a place where you can write on what you want, or go and work in the field that you're interested in writing on and become an expert that way. So I quit, much to my mum's dismay that I was quitting a national newspaper when I'd left university. And I applied for every voluntary sector role I could find, entry-level jobs in the charity sector, premature baby charities, animal welfare charities, any charity just to get a foot in the door because I had no experience. And I got an administrator role at the charity Race on the Agenda, sometimes referred to as Rota. And they were a small black-led social policy charity based in London. And I was their administrator for a couple of years, working to the chief executive, Diana Cox, who was an incredible mentor and leader. And during that time, there was a priority around weapon carrying in London, why young people were weapon carrying. This is like 2006, 2007.
Mm-hmm. So that was also it
was a peak time.
Well,
there was a peak in kind of murders in London. Young people, 14, 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, a number of shootings as well as stabbings at that time and other forms of violence. In fact, a friend of our family's, a young person who grew up in the area we were living in at the time, was killed, but he was killed with a brick. So, there was all sorts of weapons being used, all forms of violence being used. And I was involved as a volunteer on that project on the side of my administrator job to just learn how kind of policy was developed. And there was another young person working on it, but he left. So I took over the project, and it was a peer-led project to try to identify from young people's perspectives why other young people were carrying weapons in London. And we managed to get Choice FM, the radio station, to host the focus groups, as Leicester Square was a relatively neutral zone, and we advertised the focus groups on the radio. So loads of young people turned up for interview who you wouldn't normally interview for stuff like this. And just under half of them were young women. And the incentive was you got to go and tour the studios and meet the DJs. So I held focus groups over a couple of days at the Choice FM studios. And that was my entry point, really, was young people talking about weapon carrying, talking about how safe they felt often at home, but unsafe when they felt unsafe when they left their homes. Talking about a range of different weapons, experiences of violence, schools, public spaces. And that I kind of, once that piece of work started, I never looked back. And for a long time focused on young women, given the numbers that showed up at the time, given I was a young woman, and given not many people were talking about young women back in 2006-07 in the UK. So that was kind of my entry point. And I worked in the charity sector then for a number of years at Rota, and then at Barnardo's, and then in policy organisations like the Children's Commissioner's Office before I moved into academia.
Over that time, you presumably noticed a lot of stuff about safeguarding as a practice, as a principle, what was going right, what was going wrong. So over that formative period of time, what was the kind of the main takeaway about safeguarding?
Well, there were two, if I have permission to talk about two realizations. I think the first was the entry point into the PhD, and then one was kind of fell out of the PhD. So when I started doing my doctorate, I was really interested in how many silos we had created at that point, how separate a lot of the work was. Mm-hmm. Because I'd focused on young women, I straddled lots of different working environments. So I would often sit at round tables on violence against women and girls. And then I'd sit on a different round table about violence between young people. And then I'd sit on a different round table around exploitation. And I was thinking, why are all of these and they were different people as well, these different meetings, all using different risk assessment tools, all using different services, different language. And I was really interested in what young women were experiencing in each of those. And they were often the minority. So in kind of violence against women, settings. The girls' piece was often an add-on, and young women weren't really understood by those that largely served adults. Or in the violence between young people, or it was called youth violence back then, space, most people were talking about young men, although they weren't saying young men, and so young women's experiences were forgotten. And so we saw this, and then in the exploitation space, they were often talking about a kind of an older boyfriend type model, it was referred to at the time, a much older individual man, often grooming and exploiting sexually a young girl on her own, not group-based assaults or exploitation or peer-to-peer exploitation. So wherever I was, the group I was interested in was in the minority. And I was really interested in that, in how people got lost in systems and how systems were built around issues rather than built around kind of what people needed, what people experienced. So the PhD was trying to understand, if we looked at different incidents that were categorized differently by services, was then enough that they shared in common that you could make the case for just a holistic response to what young people were experiencing rather than this very segregated response. And that was my entry point, and that was what my kind of initial realization. And that is still an issue. And we saw that with the murder of Eliane in South London. Was that 2023 that happened? You know, again, there was division between those that were talking about youth violence and those that were talking about violence against women. You know, we really hadn't moved on to offering an integrated, holistic account of young people's experiences. But then doing the PhD and looking at young people's files who had lost their lives or been sexually assaulted by other young people, and looking at the files of those young people as well, I was fascinated by what the social workers were doing. And that was the thing that often was in common. You know, I was looking at whether the harms were different or similar, and they were highly similar in terms of particularly context being important. But what was more interesting to me was the fact that in the files, everyone was assessing whether these children's parents could protect them. And if their parents could protect them, everyone kind of stepped back and the intervention focused on fixing that child and their bad decisions.
Can you give an example of that?
Yeah. So like, you know, a parent who was doing all they could, calling the police whenever the young person was missing from home, driving them to the school gate to get them in the school gate, telling the school everything that was happening, asking for help constantly. They were often left on their own, like, well, you're doing everything you can. There's no role for social work. Social work intervenes when parents are doing something wrong. And these were children who had already been physically assaulted with weapons, children who had been sexually assaulted in public spaces, in school environments, you know, and people were just saying, well, either the parent is at fault, they're not controlling their child, so we intervene with the parent, we'll put you on a parenting course, or we'll deal with whatever it is you're struggling with, and then you'll be better able to protect your child. Or you're doing everything you can, so there's nothing we can do for you, and we'll put your child on a 12-week healthy relationships project or a 12-week knife awareness project, and then they'll learn about their bad behavior or they'll learn about the bad behavior they're experiencing from others, and then they'll make better choices. And they were like the options. And I just couldn't understand why you would assess a parent's capacity to protect their child from a risk that was emanating from outside of the family. Like that, it blew my mind. And it was interesting coming in as an outsider because I just didn't understand it. And I thought I was misreading it. And then spent a lot more time with social workers and realized, oh, our system is built on an assumption that when something goes wrong for a child, you look at their parents. Everything we've designed is built around that, built around parental responsibility and individual responsibility. It's one or the other. If it's a child protection issue, it's a parental responsibility issue. If it's a youth delinquency issue, youth violence issue, youth justice issue, it's a young person's responsibility. So we're either fixing the parent or the young person. And in neither of those systems are we going to fix the context in which that harm is occurring. And, you know, that was kind of the foundation of where everything else then took off from.
Contextual safeguarding.
Safeguarding, yes.
If you're enjoying this conversation, you can follow this podcast safe wherever you want to watch or listen. 2025 now marks 10 years, I believe, since you kind of coined that term and started using it. Before we get onto its meaning, my understanding of, I might have got this wrong, but my understanding of that time for you, getting an MBE prior to that, having your work thrust into limelight quite quickly must have been quite a lot, and it must have been, yeah. I'm just interested in that period of time, basically. Obviously, like you were doing amazing work, but I guess personally, the weight of responsibility comes with that, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It was a very high pressured time. I mean, everyone tells you that no one's ever going to read your thesis apart from the examiners and you. So the idea that anyone else read it was a bit of a no one said this was actually going to happen moment. I mean, things like the MBE came a lot earlier. And I think a lot of that was around the young women's work. And it was a moment in political time. And sometimes I take these things with a pinch of salt. I had to think long and hard about whether I wanted to accept it at all. And at the time, I had no other letters behind or in front of my name. And so it was a helpful way to get young women's voices into policy and into tables where they were being forgotten. The PhD for me was a little different because it was something I actually worked for. I didn't feel like I worked for any of the other awards I got. People just decided that this year was my year. In another year, it wouldn't have been, and the work would have still been important. But the PhD I really did want because I wanted the time to really think about what was going on. And I don't think I would have come to contextual safeguarding if I hadn't done the PhD, because I sat with those case files for 3 years to try to work out what they were saying to me and what I needed to say to other people. They were very harrowing cases. And what was really interesting to me was I ended up with a skin condition while I was doing my PhD. And I think it was literally the physical stress of reviewing the material. And I talked to my team about this because it often wasn't viewing the material about the harm, the violence, like that I could review. It was reviewing the ineffective and often blaming response to the violence that I found most disturbing. I couldn't cope with it, that children were coming forward, were saying what was happening to them, and we were letting them down at best and blaming them at worst. I mean, this was just unbearable to me. So yes, there was a lot of pressure once people decided that contextual safeguarding was useful. I think the reason people found it useful, so I've come to understand, is it gave a language to explain what people already knew to be the case. They could already see it. Often people say it's common sense. Parents often say to me, CS doesn't stand for contextual safeguarding, it stands for common sense. I said, it does. It's common sense and it's counterculture. It's counter everything that we do and how we've designed our systems. So it feels like it should be really easy if a child's being harmed in their peer group or in a park or in a school, we should target that place to create safety for them. That sounds really obvious, but it's just not what we do. As I said, we target their parents or we target them. So it's really counterculture. So I think everyone got whipped up with it initially because the phrase helped them explain a frustration they were facing when they were looking at what a child was saying to them and they were operating in a system that couldn't actually engage with what was being said to them. They couldn't respond in a way that was effective. And often we're moving children, and we still do this a lot, moving them away from relatively safe families, sometimes safe relationships with professionals, sometimes safe school environments, sometimes some safe friends, move them away from those safe places to get them away from the unsafe places that those relationships are always also based in. And then we strip them away from everything that they know. Either we secure them or we move them hundreds of miles away, often at very high cost to local authorities, tens of thousands of pounds, hundreds of thousands of pounds a year per child, per placement, to do something we know often is harmful and doesn't fix the root cause of what is going on for that child, but gives everyone a breather. We saw a lot of that going on in the case files. And so, yes, there was pressure on me. I was surprised at the response. Me and my colleague, Jenny Lloyd, who's worked with me and my team for the longest time and was involved in the first system tests of contextual safeguarding, we were both like, this is, I don't know what to do with this. Like, we're still working this out. And everyone's talking about it like it's a finished product. Like it's in people's job titles and it's in the name of teams, and whole teams have been set up called contextual safeguarding teams or contextual safeguarding panels. And I'm thinking, that's odd because we're still working out what this is. But I also understood what it was. And so I think the pressure for me, there's a few things. One is the pressure to be honest. And that's where I think academia actually for me has been helpful. I'm not trying to sell a product. I'm not trying to convince people that they must do what I think. No, this is my thinking. These are my ideas. If they're useful to you, use them with integrity, use them well. But if you think something else is more helpful to you, go and use that. My team always laugh at me sometimes because people say, oh, we're going to do it like this. And I say, that's fine. That's not contextual safeguarding, just so you know, but you do that. Because it's not, if someone wants to say to me, we don't think context is relevant, we don't feel like we need to respond to context, I'm not here to convince anyone of that. But I am here to be honest about what we do know and what we don't. And so I feel I definitely have a responsibility not to oversell the idea, to be very clear that it is an idea, it's a principle, it's a philosophy, it's not a model, it's not a manual, it's not a silver bullet, it's not going to fix everything for you. But it definitely makes sense of some shortfalls in our system. And if you want to resolve those shortfalls, it might help you. So I think there's a responsibility for me to be honest, and also to be honest where things have ended up being implemented in ways I'd never intended. Mm-hmm. I think working with young people's friendship groups is an ethically challenging practice space. And when I first made recommendations about mapping and assessing friendship groups, that came from directly from young people. So young people had sat down with social workers, youth justice workers, and said, these are who my friends are. This is who witnessed this. This is who assaulted me. And what I found interesting in those statements was the assessments didn't map that out. So the intervention was still with that one child who was moved and then moved and moved again. And all the other children that she had named, and this was a young woman who had been sexually assaulted for about 18 months by a group of 13 to 15-year-old young men. All those young people had either social workers or youth justice workers. And the young women who had witnessed the assaults also had workers. But each of those workers worked independently of each other, all on their own plan for that individual young person. There was no plan for the group. There was no plan for the context they were spending their time in. And to me, that made no sense because the behavior of those individuals influenced each other and influenced how unsafe or safe she was. So the recommendation that we should have been assessing that peer group and mapping it to make sense of it, because there were a lot of them, came directly from what she had told professionals. She was trying to explain the situation she was in. She was giving them the contextual information. They didn't use it appropriately. Over time, that has morphed into mapping all of young people's connections without their consent, sharing information with each other without ever letting a young person know that that's what you're doing.
So this is people taking contextual safeguarding and using it as a way to do those things.
Yeah, they think, contextual safeguarding means mapping young people's friends. And it doesn't. If a young person has told you a lot of information about their friends to try to help you build safety for them, you may need to map that out if there's a lot of them. We've seen some really brilliant work to move young people together when they're friends together, and they need to be moved away from their local area, then moved together into a placement for say 6 months, and they don't go missing from that placement because they're together, so they're not running away to see each other. Okay, so that's friendship intervention. That's recognizing the value of those friends. They care for each other, but where they are and that physically where they are is unsafe, and when they're together they're unsafe in that space. So let's move them, let's see what happens. They stay in placement, we can bring them back when things calm down. We've seen social workers advocate to keep young people in hostel placements together when actually peer assessments have shown that the friendship is safe, but actually when those young people move around into certain localities, they become unsafe, but to separate them would be detrimental to their emotional well-being. So peer assessments, assessing young people's peer relationships and friendships can be a really critical component of contextual safeguarding, but that's often in collaboration with those young people, thoughtful about the needs and dynamics of those relationships. We often say you need to consider the group dynamic or the friendship dynamic if it's two people. the guardianship around that group. So who are the trusted adults they have access to, and the environments those groups are spending their time in. And then you build your plan to support them around those three areas. That is contextual safeguarding. What is not contextual safeguarding is everyone sharing information about all the kids that know each other and drawing them all on a big map just so that they've all shared that information. They don't know what they're going to do with it. Now everybody knows about people's friendships. There's been no consideration of threshold, of privacy, of consent. And that's a way to damage relationships, because all you need is one worker to go and tell another young person about something they're not meant to know. No one's had that conversation with the young people, and then they've lost trust. And losing the trust of a young person, that can be the thing that keeps that young person alive. So you don't want to undermine that. That has to be given a lot of serious thought. And often the best way to do it is with consent wherever possible. So there have been times where I've had to say, yeah, okay, I can see what people are doing, and I've contributed to that by talking about peer mapping and peer assessment. This is not ethical and this is not what I meant. And often we work in a culture where you just always have to be right, rather than recognizing that you can have unintended consequences with your work. And when that happens, you have to be clear on what you intended and what you're going to do to help turn that tide. And so we've published resources on peer assessment and case studies on what we mean about peer assessment, and encourage people to think about friendship and to work with young people to talk about peer assessment. So we've done a lot of work to try to fix that. But I think that's what comes with something being a philosophy rather than a manual. People are going to interpret it, and sometimes they interpret it well and sometimes they don't.
You preempted my next question, which is interested just in your. It makes sense that you study philosophy, and I was wondering if like your work and observations have been sort of underpinned by Pierre Bourdieu, right?
Yes.
And I wondered if you could just explain how something that potentially people could see as quite an abstract practice has helped you to understand and then make very practical decisions and make a very practical path in your career to try and fix this problem using that.
So I'm a big Pierre Bourdieu fan. Everybody that knows me knows this, because his sociological framing of things helped me understand the files I was reading when I did my PhD. My starting point is always with theory, any kind of theory, because people often start to fall asleep when you talk about theory. I see theory like a pair of glasses. Like, you put on a pair of glasses and it helps you see things in a certain way. You put on a pair of glasses with blue lenses, everything looks a bit more blue. You put on a pair of glasses with orange lenses, everything looks a bit more orange. Everything looks closer, everything looks further away, depending on the nature of the lens. So when I put on my pair of Pierre Bourdieu glasses and I look at my case study data, what do I see? I see a really clear relationship between context and individual decision making. Now, he was very clear that individual behavior is informed by context, and contexts are informed by individuals. This isn't about things being done to us. We're in an ongoing relationship with the context that we spend time in. And sometimes we make decisions that go to our detriment to survive in a context by maintaining the status quo. So an example in terms of young people would be weapon carrying, okay? So I know, enough people have told me, like, I'm more likely to be injured with a knife if I carry one. But I'm so afraid to travel to and from college without being armed. And I don't see services as a route to safety. I don't see the police as a source of safety. I don't see other adults looking out for my well-being. So despite this potentially being to my detriment, I'm going to do that. But then by doing that, I'm maintaining the rules of that social environment, which is the way that you stay safe is to arm yourself. And so we see a circular process. And you notice that this isn't just young people making that decision. Police officers have informed that decision by their absence or overpresence. A lack or provision of youth work will have informed that decision. How the general public view young people would have informed that decision. So we all play a role in shaping those environments, and young people play a role in shaping those environments. And then Bourdieu talks about capital, which is basically the things that you have access to give you less or more status in any given environment, which includes money, includes who you know, your social networks, and it includes your understanding of a culture of a place, like your ability to use the right language and so on and so forth. I think one of the things I hope for contextual safeguarding is that it rehumanizes a lot of the work that we do in this space, and that it rehumanizes those in, how we view others who are impacted by this. There's a lot of dehumanization of children and young people and their families in this space, both in terms of media coverage, but also in terms of professional meetings, where you just hear children being referred to as a risk rating or a category or a harm type or a list of offences or a nominal, rather than by their name. And we lose the child and we lose their family, and everyone becomes a set of adverse childhood experiences score. That's not the way that you do safeguarding. That's not the way that you provide help. And we have seen over time in areas that have really invested in developing a contextual safeguarding approach and seeing people in the context of how they live their lives, far less judgment, far less blame, far more recognition that this could be me, this could be my child.
Can you just bring to life maybe one of the examples of one of the success stories? I know that you've referred to a few different young people across your time and some of the problems they've been coming up against. And is there a sort of geographical place in this country where you're like, actually, it's being done really well there, and I've seen the journey it's gone on? There might still be more to do, but I'm just interested in really, anyone watching or listening to this to be able to like see and feel a success story of this.
We've seen some really brilliant work in one part of the country where young people were congregating under a shelter in a park, and there was some concerns about their welfare, but there was also a lot of complaints about them, to the point that a local councillor had proposed removing the roof of the shelter so that young people would get wet if it rained and they would move on. And youth workers and social workers got together, assessed the park, assessed the friendship group, worked with the young people and advocated to residents' meetings, to politicians, to keep that shelter in the park, to move it slightly further in, but to keep it there, and to build guardianship, protective adults around those young people so they could be in the park and they could be there safely, because there were concerns around exploitation for them and unsafe adults approaching them. So really incredible work happening in that park. And then those young people designed a support program they wanted from the youth workers on things they had questions about. And that support program was run for them. And then there was an intergenerational fun day in the park to try to kind of build some of those bridges between members of the community. So we definitely see when people kind of get hold of contextual safeguarding, whether it's in quite formalised child protection processes or more informal kind of youth and community work, ways in which contexts are foregrounded, parks, schools, friendship groups, and where services and systems are held to account and not just young people and their families.
Across a lot of your examples, whether that's a park or a school or whatever, there are always professionals and people and practitioners who are there. I think one of the things that struck me about your work is that you also don't close the responsibility on people that are working, quote unquote, with young people directly or in their job title, but also with those who are just about, they're like a shopkeeper or a bin man, or they're in the community. And it resonated a lot for various reasons, but one of them is that the sense of community in this country has been dismantled, you could argue, and we're in a space where it's difficult to build that back. So I see your challenge to people and trying to like train and inform everyday people to try and keep young people safe as aligned with what we need to do more broadly to build community. And I just wondered if you could kind of explain that a bit, that idea that like actually everyone is responsible and everyone can be better at safeguarding young people.
We've started to think about this through a concept that we call guardianship. So kind of public space guardianship or community guardianship. So who are the adults in public spaces that young people want there and that young people trust? And often they're not formal roles. In the original cases I reviewed for my PhD, one young woman, she used to run into a corner shop all the time when she felt unsafe, the same corner shop, and speak to the shop owner there. And unfortunately, he wasn't connected in with anybody to then raise a concern, but he was very much a trusted adult in that community, and was doing the best that he could. And we've seen in other scenarios when we've done kind of a local area assessment of a public space where there's concerns about violence, a chicken shop owner saying, oh, no, every time things start to heat up in here, I just give out free chicken wings and it calms everyone down. And he's doing guardianship. Like he wouldn't call it that, but he's doing guardianship. He's kind of keeping the peace. And in both of those examples, what we see are not adults who are professionally qualified in understanding the root causes of violence or know how to spot the signs of grooming. They are adults that young people trust. And they are adults that like young people. That's literally it. And often I think we're so proceduralized in this country. We're so obsessed with process and manuals that we overcomplicate things. And even in this world around violence reduction and different forms of exploitation, for example, most of the work that we hear of with taxi drivers or shopkeepers or hoteliers is training them on the dynamics of exploitation and what the harm looks like. And we've missed a step with that work because we've assumed that all of those people like young people. And a lot of people in this country do not like young people. They do not like teenagers. And we have a society that often frames teenagers as a risk rather than at risk. So you can't just go straight launch into kind of very specific topics. You have to go right back to help people remember what it was like to be a teenager in the first place and to recognize that these are children. There's a reason why they might be loud. There's a reason why they might be in groups of more than two at a time. This is all developmentally expected, developmentally normal. This does not make them harmful. This does not make them problematic. This does not make them antisocial. The basics on adolescent brain development would be a good way to start with kind of helping society better appreciate what our young people bring for us and the value that comes with being an adolescent. Like, what a time to be alive. You've got this, 15-year window? And some people probably think they're not adolescents anymore. If you're under 25, you're still an adolescent. People often think it's 18. It's like 15-year window from 10 to 25 where you love taking risks. You get a real thrill out of it rather than the absolute fear, which grips me now when I try to take a risk. You want to make some decisions for yourself. You want people to stop telling you what to do. You want to take responsibility for yourself. Great. You're motivated by a quick win. Often looks like you're being motivated by the weekend, Monday caring about Friday, but actually short-term gains can motivate you in a way that the older you get, the more you're thinking, oh, what's the long term? What's in it for me in the long term?
Yeah.
And then, thanks to puberty, you're emotionally all over the place, but you're also falling in love for the first time. You're finding these friendships that might, that can be the thing that carry you through really difficult times. I know some of my best friends from school carried me through my adolescence, and without them, I don't know where I would be. So this is a brilliant time. Yeah. But what we see is people who take too many risks, people who don't do as they're told, people who don't know the long-term consequences of what they do, and people who are emotionally all over the place. And that's a problem for us. It's a problem for our society. It's a problem for our services. And that's why we then see loads of interventions focused on fixing the young person, consequential thinking and this type of stuff. You don't fully develop the cognitive skills to do long-term consequential thinking till you're 25. But we fixate on that being the problem. You're not going to know these people in 10 years' time. I don't know why you care about what they think about you. I don't know how many times I heard that growing up. And I'm sure I will slip into saying that to my child, and I'll have to watch back a podcast and remind myself how annoying that is. Because it doesn't really matter if you don't know the people you were friends with when you were a teenager, when you're 30. It matters when you're a teenager because you don't want to be on your own. You want to be sat with someone at lunch. You want to have somewhere to go at the weekend. So understanding how brilliant young people are, understanding the opportunity that comes with that time in your life. And that's what youth workers are brilliant at because they commit to working with teenagers. Kind of getting that energy into other parts of our society where young people are anyway. They're on buses, they're in shopping centres, they're on high streets, they're in parks. They should be safe in all of those places. They should also be safe in school, and they should be safe wherever they are, If they're not, the people that run those spaces, have oversight of those spaces, benefit financially and otherwise from young people being in those spaces, have a responsibility not to be the eyes and ears of statutory services and act as extended surveillance, but just to be kind. Because if they are kind and respectful, if a young person is in trouble, they will come to them. And that is what we have seen, young people running into shops where they're unsafe, seeking help from people that they trust. That's what we want. We want adults everywhere where young people feel that they are cared for and that they trust. And those contexts being places where they can be and spend their time. It really is common sense when you think about it like that. But, you know, we're in a society that just doesn't function in that way.
We're coming to the end now, and I just wondered if you had sort of final words for someone who has sat through and listened to you. What's like one or two things that you'd like people to take away practically in their lives?
Okay, so I think there would be 2 or 3 things. If you are a parent listening to this, because often I talk and then someone comes over to me and they're like, I'm just thinking about my child and I'm really worried now about my child. Always say to them, there's 2 things you can do as a parent when you've got a teenager. One is to let them know they can always come home. And the other thing is that they can tell you anything. That's it. You don't have control over what happens on the bus on the way to school, what happens when they're in school. You can't control that. But you can control how they see you and how they see their home context, yeah? And that will open up all sorts of things for you because you may get to understand those other contexts for them and they may allow you in ways that other parents won't be allowed into those places and spaces where they spend their time. So that would be the message for parents. If you are someone who is a friend of a parent or just in a community, in our society, I guess the message is that everyone can play a role in creating safety for young people, and that's just by being kind and respectful and looking out for the welfare of young people, recognizing that they can be vulnerable and that everyone can play a role in keeping them safe. And that doesn't mean jumping in the middle of fights. It means being a place that young people can seek refuge should they need that. And I guess the third message is for anyone directly involved in this work is to really be hopeful that contexts can change. I think a lot of our focus on fixing individuals is a belief that we can't do anything about the situations they're in, so we just have to get them to behave better or get their parents to do something better, because that feels like it's in our control. And all these other things feel like they're outside of our control. But 10 years into doing contextual safeguarding, I've seen enough work in local areas across the country to demonstrate that it is absolutely possible to build safety in school environments, in public spaces, in friendship groups where young people are spending their time. And that if we do that with young people, in collaboration with them and in a way that centres care and humanity, then we will shift the tide for young people, and we will see an increasing number of safe spaces where young people spend their time and a decreasing number of unsafe spaces.
Thank you. Thank you, Carlene, for joining us.
No worries. Thank you for having me.
So what I took away from that conversation with Carlene, I enjoyed it a lot and I learned a lot. Maybe there's 2 things that stick out. The first one is just that how much she's applied her own passions and journey to her role as a safeguarding expert. It's easy to treat someone as a sort of professional and see them in this light of just producing academic work and producing very serious, important professional output, but actually understanding the person behind that work was really, really interesting for me. And the second thing is that I feel like I personally gained a lot of skills and wisdom that I can apply to life generally as a citizen and a person like moving through public spaces where young people spend time, just to make sure everyone's safer. So I hope, everyone at home also gains something like that as well. If you're new to this topic and you want to find out more about the Youth Endowment Fund's work preventing violence amongst children and young people, you can head to our website. The link is in the description of this episode.